This isn't easy to talk about, not after everything it cost me and everything it's still taking. I've worn the badge of a tribal police officer for 13 years, long enough to know our land keeps its own history and its own rules. You learn early what you should report, what you shouldn't, and what no one will ever believe. But what I saw out there, those tracks cutting to the red earth, weren't made by anything that walks under the sun. I'm sharing this now because someone has to, because silence is starting to feel like betrayal. And because if even one person hears this and understands, maybe what happened to my trainee won't happen again. If you're still listening, good. Just know, once you hear the rest, you don't get to unknow it. And maybe that's why I hesitated for so damn long. The hardest thing for outsiders to understand about our reservation is the scale of it. People hear desert and picture something manageable, sand, cactus, sky, done. But the land I patrol stretches so far in every direction that even we, the ones raised on it, don't know all its scars and hollows. Half our maps end in blank beige squares labeled only with grid numbers. The northern flats, wide, wind-gnawed, stubbornly unmapped, sit inside one of those squares. Elders warn us not to cross them after dark, not because of anything dramatic, but because the land loses track of you out there. I used to think it was poetic. Later, I learned it wasn't. That morning started ordinary. Heat rising early, dust lifting off the road in sheets, radio chatter about a stray dog near the community school. Daniel Begay rode beside me, tapping a slow rhythm against his thigh. He'd been doing that since training. Never enough to be annoying, just enough to let you know he carried a storm of thoughts he rarely shared. Daniel was 22, sharp-eyed, soft-voiced, and carried his grandmother's teachings like invisible armor. He'd joined the tribal police not for glory, but because, in his words, someone should carry both sides of things, the badge and the stories. I'd been his field officer for 3 months, and in that time, he'd become the closest thing I had to a younger brother. When dispatch called about livestock trouble on the eastern boundary, I barely reacted. We get those calls all the time, coyotes, mountain lions, sometimes feral dogs from outside the res. Tribal protocol is straightforward. Assess the site, confirm the threat, review fence lines, and verify there's no cartel sign. The eastern boundary sits close enough to the highway that smuggling crews occasionally cut through at night. Nothing about the call sounded unusual, but I remember Daniel going still, his tapping stopping mid-beat. "Where exactly on the boundary?" he asked dispatch. His voice was steady, but something beneath it frayed slightly. The dispatcher gave coordinates. Daniel looked out the windshield, toward land that shimmered pale and empty. "That's close to the old holding grounds." I shrugged, still within our patrol zone. He didn't argue, but he folded his hands together the way he did when he was trying not to say something. The rancher waited for us outside his small goat pen. He was an older man, white mustache trembling as he spoke. I'd known him for years and had never seen him look like that, like he'd run out of breath and didn't know how to get it back. "They weren't eaten," he said before we even asked. "Not one bite, just torn open like someone was looking for something." His voice cracked on that last part. The pen was a mess of kicked-up dirt, splintered posts, and blood that had dried into rusty streaks. But it wasn't the violence that bothered me. It was the precision. 5 goats lay in a perfect semicircle, as if arranged for display. Not scattered, not chased, positioned. Daniel's breath hitched. That was the first moment I felt real tension from him. Quiet, dense, as if he were bracing for an echo of something only he could hear. I crouched beside the nearest carcass. No scavenger had touched it. Even insects kept a wide berth. The tearing wasn't from teeth. It was too clean, too uniform. "This looks staged," I muttered. The rancher nodded vigorously, hands trembling. That's what scared me. Whatever did this, it wasn't eating. It was organizing. I stood, swept the area with practiced eye. "Daniel, check for prints." He was already moving slowly along the edge of the pen, scanning the sand with the attention of someone reading a sacred text. After a moment, he called softly, "Sir." I walked over. He pointed to a track half hidden by the morning glare. At first glance, it resembled a hoof print, but it wasn't, not even close. The impression was long, too long for any desert animal, and narrow, shaped like something stepping with a blade instead of a foot. The depth told me whatever made it was heavy, but the spacing between prints was unnervingly even, identical from one to next. No stagger, no missteps, no shifting weight. Perfect precision. "What the hell?" I whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. "We shouldn't be seeing these." "Why?" I pressed. He shook his head, refusing to look at me. "Just, they're not meant for us." It was an odd phrasing. It stuck in my mind the way static clings to a radio frequency. I crouched again, running a finger along the edge of the track. The sand was compacted into a smooth wall, almost fused, as if heat had been involved. No natural animal prints do that. "We need to report this," I said, reaching for my radio. Daniel took a step back. Maybe not everything needs to go in a report. I stared at him. That was unlike him. Daniel was diligent to a fault, the kind of trainee who color-coded his incident logs. "We follow procedure." I reminded him. He didn't argue, but he did whisper something under his breath. Words and dying I recognized only as a prayer meant to keep distance between you and something you shouldn't have noticed. I raised the radio to my mouth. Unit 3 responding to livestock disturbance. Found 5 deceased animals. Unknown trauma pattern requesting. A burst of static swallowed my voice. Not normal static. Layered. Like several voices speaking at once from different distances. Then the channel clicked and Dispatch's voice came through. Except it wasn't her. Not exactly. "Copy, copy, copy." Unit 3 confirm. Her words looped over themselves, wrong pitch, wrong cadence. I lowered the radio slowly. Daniel's face had gone pale. "It doesn't like being named," he whispered. "Stop talking like that." I snapped more harshly than intended. I chalked the radio issues up to terrain interference. It happened sometimes in low valleys or dense mesas, but the air here was wide open. Nothing should have been blocking the signal. I tried again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3. Do you read?" Silence. Then a faint voice, my own voice, repeated the exact sentence back to me, warped like it had been dragged across gravel. I froze. Daniel stepped further away, fists clenched. The rancher muttered something about calling the state police instead and hurried back toward his house. I didn't follow. My attention stayed fixed on the prints, those impossible tracks leading out of the pen, across the sand, toward a pale ridge in the distance. The restricted lands began beyond that ridge. Daniel stood very still, staring in the same direction. He didn't move until the wind shifted, just a thin breeze, but enough to ripple the dust and reveal more prints. A line of them, stretching farther than I could see. He backed up 2 steps, then 3, stopping only when he nearly bumped into the fence. "We shouldn't follow those," he said. His voice was almost a whisper, but the fear in it cracked like ice under weight. "They're not meant for us." I looked at him, really looked. The way his jaw locked, the way his hands wouldn't unclench, the way his eyes refused to blink. This wasn't about fear of an animal. This was something deeper, older, buried under the stories he carried. But the badge on my chest felt heavier. Duty meant following leads. Protocol meant tracking threats. And whatever left those prints was a threat, one that didn't fit any category I knew. Daniel must have sensed my thoughts. Slowly, painfully, he turned his gaze from the ridge to me. "Please," he murmured. "Some paths aren't meant for officers. Some things don't want to be chased." Behind him, the desert stretched empty and endless. Ahead of us, the prints cut a perfect line into forbidden land. And in that moment, the first moral fracture formed. Obey the warnings of his people, or obey the demands of my badge. The choice didn't feel urgent yet, but it would, sooner than either of us imagined. And that line of impossible tracks waited, patient as a hell breath, leading us somewhere we were never supposed to go. Back at the station, the silence felt heavier than the desert heat we'd left behind. I could still see those impossible tracks burned into my mind, long, narrow, measured with precision no living thing uses. Daniel kept close behind me as I made my way to my desk, neither of us speaking. The unease clung to him like a shadow, and followed me into the report room. Protocol required we log the livestock incident immediately, So I opened a digital file and began typing. 5 goats found to sea/lacerations non-predatory/unusual tracks of unknown origin. Before I could finish, Captain Houseman stepped in. He wasn't tribal. He'd been assigned from state years ago, but he knew when something rattled his officers. "Let's keep that right up simple," he said, tapping his knuckle on the doorframe. "Rancher reports animal attack. No follow-up needed unless fish and game wants it." I frowned. "Sir, the tracks alone require documentation." He shook his head. "No need to start rumors. People panic over nothing out here." It wasn't nothing. Houseman exhaled through his nose, the way he did when he wanted to shut down a conversation without raising his voice. "Just log it as a probable coyote or stray dog attack. That's all." He walked out before I could argue further, leaving the door to swing half shut behind him. Daniel lingered in the hallway, arms crossed tightly. He didn't look surprised at the pushback. If anything, he looked resigned. "You knew they'd say that," I said. He nodded once. "Some things they'd rather not encourage us to look at." It was an odd comment, but I let it slide. For the moment, after I filed the watered-down report, our regional wildlife biologist, Dr. Mills, stopped by. I'd sent him photos from the scene earlier, still hoping someone with field expertise could make sense of the prints. Mills was usually curious to a fault, always interested in anomalies, eager to analyze anything out of the ordinary. Today, though, he barely glanced at the images on my screen. Goats? Something spooked a predator. They scatter, get trampled, you get weird patterns. Happens all the time. He spoke quickly, too quickly, and shut the file before I could scroll to the tracks. I reopened the photo. "These aren't scatter prints. Look at the spacing." "No need. I've seen enough." "You haven't looked. Mills, name one predator out here that leaves prints like that." He gave the faintest hint of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes the simplest answer is right. Don't overthink it, officer." He walked out before I could press further. As soon as his footsteps faded, Daniel leaned against the doorframe. He didn't want to see them. I rubbed my eyes. I don't know what the hell is going on, but something about this isn't right. Daniel hesitated, then closed the door fully behind him. "The tracks," he said quietly, "look like something from the stories my grandmother told. Not an animal, not a spirit either. More like..." He searched for the right words. "A walker between forms." I frowned. "Meaning what? Shapeshifter?" He shook his head sharply. "No, not a creature. A choice. A decision the land makes when someone or something starts changing what shouldn't be changed." "That doesn't make sense," I said. But the truth was, it made more sense than anything Dr. Mills had tried to feed us. Daniel went on, voice barely above a whisper. "My people say that when tracks appear in perfect patterns, when they don't overlap, don't falter, don't wander, it's because they aren't made by feet. They're placed like markers." I didn't want to believe that. My training demanded logic, evidence, natural explanations. But the images from the scene kept replaying in my mind. That perfect spacing, that unnatural shape, the semicircle of torn animals arranged like a warning or a demonstration. "Even if that's true," I said, "it doesn't tell us what we're dealing with." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it tells us we shouldn't treat it like a normal case." I pushed away from the desk. Normal or not, something killed those goats. Something left those prints. And it wasn't a coyote. We spent the next hour reviewing older livestock reports. Most of them were vague, no photos, no detailed notes. But when I cross-referenced dates, a pattern began to emerge. 5 incidents in the past 3 months. None reported formally. All dismissed as unknown predator, and each occurring exactly 19 days apart. "Why 19? I murmured. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Cycles. Some things follow them. Not natural things." He didn't answer. I printed the dates and incident notes, then drove with Daniel to see Elder Natani, one of the few people whose counsel carried weight across multiple clans. He met us outside as Hogan, staring at us with tired eyes. "You brought questions," he said before we even spoke. I held out the printout. We found tracks this morning, unusual ones, and we think these earlier events may be connected. He didn't touch the paper. Instead, he motioned for us to sit. Wind pushed sand against the wooden beams behind him, whispering like a restless voice. Sometimes, he began, the land reminds us it is older than our rules, older than our fences, older than your badge. He nodded toward me, older even than our stories. We're looking for answers, I said. Something's out there. He sighed through his nose. When these prints appear the way you describe, deep, narrow, too perfect, it means someone is being called. Daniel stiffened. I leaned forward. Called by what? Natani shook his head. It's not a what. It is a when. A moment. A turning. A claiming. That doesn't mean anything, I said, frustration rising. The elder looked at me with pity. Not everything gives answers in the way you want them. His refusal wasn't anger. It was fear disguised as restraint. When we left, Daniel kept silent the entire drive back to the station. I wanted to ask him what claim meant in the old stories, but he looked so haunted I couldn't bring myself to push. By evening, most officers had gone home. The station was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I stayed behind to finish paperwork, but concentration slipped through my fingers. Each time I looked up, I expected to see those strange prints outside the window, marching toward the door. Eventually, I stepped outside for air. The sky was a heavy gradient of purple, stars not yet fully awake. The parking lot was empty except for our patrol units. The wind had stilled. The entire desert felt like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it. Hey, over here. Daniel's voice. I turned automatically. The sound came from the far corner of the lot, near the dumpsters. Daniel, I called. No answer. I checked the station doorway. He was still inside, visible through the window, typing slowly at his desk. A cold ripple crawled across my spine. Daniel, I called again, taking a few steps toward the sound. Something moved just out of sight, a soft scrape, like a foot dragging lightly over gravel. Then the voice came again. Right here. Same pitch, same cadence, same tired exhale Daniel used when he'd been thinking too long. But it wasn't him. I rounded the corner and stopped dead. A single print was stamped into the asphalt. Not sand, not dirt, asphalt. Long, narrow, too even, too deliberate. Smooth edged as if melted into place. My chest tightened. It hadn't just appeared in dirt this time. Whatever left it was adapting, testing, learning. Daniel finally stepped outside behind me, calling my name. I pointed at the print, unable to speak. His face drained of color. It's learning us, he whispered. Learning our voices, our steps. I stared at that impossible mark in the asphalt, realization slamming into me with a weight I wasn't ready for. Whatever is leaving these tracks isn't just moving through our land. It's watching us, studying us, and beginning to imitate us. And for the first time, I wondered if following procedure meant walking straight into something that had already begun walking toward us. The print in the asphalt haunted me through the night, but by sunrise something worse was waiting on my desk. A missing persons report forwarded from County Dispatch. A 34-year-old non-native hiker named Evan Lorne hadn't returned to his campsite. Last phone ping placed him close to the restricted boundary, almost directly along the line of those impossible tracks. The coincidence tightened around my ribs, like a belt pulled one notch too far. Daniel read the report over my shoulder, and though he said nothing, I saw the tension clench his jaw. It was the same expression he'd worn when he first saw the livestock prints, recognition laced with dread. By mid-morning, search and rescue joined us at the staging point. Their lead coordinator briefed us beneath a portable awning, the desert sun burning through even that thin layer of shade. We reviewed procedures, grid sweeps radiating from the hikers' last known coordinates, radio checkpoint spaced every 400 yards, emergency beacon triangulation if we found any electronic trace. Everything was standard protocol, neat and logical on paper. But beneath the structured language, the rescuers' faces reflected a quiet unease, like they'd all sent something off before we even stepped onto the sand. Maybe they had. Maybe the land was already speaking, and we were too stubborn to listen. We formed 2 officer teams. Daniel and I were assigned the Northern Arc, the section brushing closest to the restricted lands. As we walked, I felt a strange pressure building behind my eyes, as though the horizon were bending inward. Our radios crackled with intermittent feedback, but we tried to ignore it, repeating our status checks as ordered. About 40 minutes into the search, the malfunction worsened. Voices echoed, words overlapping themselves like a sentence spoken twice in different tones. Sometimes the channel whispered our own call signs back at us, delayed by several seconds. Once, during a routine check, I heard my voice answer before I transmitted anything at all. The rescuers blamed terrain interference. I blamed what we had already seen. We crested a low ridge of sandstone and found something that made Daniel stop. So abruptly, I nearly walked into him. There, on flat ground where the wind should have erased everything, a dozen stones lay arranged in a perfect circle, each one placed equidistant from the next, forming an impossibly clean shape. At the center sat a single deep track, identical to the ones in a livestock pen but pressed into packed earth with unnatural precision. It looked intentional, almost ceremonial, as though someone or something had marked the site with deliberate care. Daniel took 3 steps back, whispering a prayer I'd heard only once before at a burial. I crouched and brushed my fingertips over the stones. They were cold despite the heat, as if they hadn't been sitting in sunlight at all. We radio-defined, but the transmission dissolved into a low moan of static. The moment I released the button, Daniel grabbed my arm. His grip trembled. "We need to leave this spot," he said. "It shouldn't be uncovered." I opened my mouth to argue. Procedure so we mark and document everything. But something shifted in my vision before I could speak. The distant buttes on the horizon suddenly appeared closer, as though the land between us had folded in on itself. A wave of vertigo rolled through me. I blinked hard, and the distance snapped back to normal, but the afterimage left my stomach hollow. Daniel saw my reaction and quietly said, "This is what happens when you're too close to something that isn't meant to be looked at." We kept moving, though the air felt thicker now, as if it resisted each step. A half hour later, Daniel spotted something bright in a cluster of sagebrush. It was a hiker's pack, torn open down the middle with surgical cleanliness. Not ripped by claws, not shredded by teeth. Split. Nothing inside was taken. His food packets lay untouched. His water bladder hadn't been punctured. His clothes were still folded. The most unsettling part was a phone resting atop the scattered items. Its screen glowed, even though the battery should have been long dead in this heat. I picked it up. The photo app was open. Dozens of images filled the screen, each time-stamped the night he disappeared. None were selfies. None were landscapes. Every photo was aimed at darkness beyond his headlamp, capturing a faint blur at the edge of the beam, a tall shape, too narrow to be a person, too upright to be an animal. In every shot, the shape stood at the same angle, as though it had followed him in a perfect arc, while keeping precise distance. I scrolled through image after image, and the blur grew sharper, as though the camera had slowly begun to understand what it was looking at. By the final photo, I could make out its outline. Elongated limbs, a torso that looked stretched rather than built, and a head tilted in an unnatural, almost curious angle. Daniel refused to get near it. "Turn it off," he said, voice cracking. "Don't look anymore. That's how it finds people." When I asked what he meant, he backed away further, arms wrapped tightly across his chest. The emotional shift hit me hard. He wasn't just frightened. He was grieving something still happening around him. I shoved the phone into an evidence bag, though the gesture felt futile. Whatever had been watching the hiker had watched him for hours, choosing its distance with unnatural precision. The realization that it might now be watching us crawled coldly up my spine. As the sun dipped lower, the search commander called off the operation. Light disappears fast in the desert, and no one wanted to risk injuries in the uneven terrain. But walking back toward the staging area felt wrong. The air hummed with a low vibration I couldn't trace, as if the land were remembering each step we took. Twice, I thought I saw movement in my periphery, but when I turned, there was only the stillness of dying light. Daniel stayed quiet. refusing to answer any of my attempts at conversation, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead of him. We reached the vehicles just as darkness spilled across the flats. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, as though invisible eyes measured our path. Even after we drove away, the sensation lingered like a weight on my chest. Back at home that night, exhaustion dragged me under quickly, but sleep didn't bring rest. Instead, I dreamed I was walking across the desert, except the footprints ahead of me appeared before I stepped. Each one formed in perfect sync with my lifted foot, as though some phantom walker guided my path, predicting each movement before my body made it. I tried to stop in the dream, but the prints continued appearing, pulling me forward. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding so hard it felt like a warning drum. I tried to shake off the dream as stress, imagination, some psychological residue from the search. Logic demanded explanation. Protocol demanded calm. But Daniel's voice echoed softly through my memory. That's how it finds people. He believed the land itself was choosing who to follow, who to warn, and who to claim. I wasn't willing to accept that. Not yet. But the rift between us had begun to open, subtle but undeniable, dividing the world into what he feared and what I insisted must be explained. And somewhere out there, beyond our map borders, something tall and patient moved in perfect patterns, waiting for whichever of us would break first. The search for Evan Lorne ended with more questions than answers, but by the next morning, it wasn't just questions circling the station. It was pressure, real, heavy political pressure. I walked into the department meeting, expecting more coordinated search planning. Instead, I found the tribal council seated beside Captain Houseman, their expressions drawn tight. Daniel sat near the back, shoulders bowed as if bracing for a blow. The room felt smaller, hotter, as though the desert sun had followed us indoors. Councilwoman Yazzie began without preamble. "We're requesting that the investigation into the missing hiker be halted," she said. "Our land carries responsibility, but it does not owe outsiders infinite searching. We will not risk further disruption." Her tone was diplomatic, but her eyes were urgent. She wasn't simply blocking resources. She was afraid of what we were stirring up. Captain Houseman then passed around the written directive. The hiker's disappearance was to be classified as environmental exposure, nothing more. Case closed. Something inside me recoiled. "With respect, we shouldn't shut this down," I said. "We have evidence of unusual activity. Tracks that don't match any known species. A torn pack, distorted radio contact. And we found enough." Houseman snapped softly. "We're not feeding conspiracy theories. It's not a conspiracy if it's happening." I shot back. A tense silence fell. Daniel shifted forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should stop," he said. "The land is choosing paths now. We can't keep ignoring that." I stared at him. Choosing paths. His words felt like the continuation of an argument we'd never properly begun. He met my gaze, and for the first time I saw the full depth of his fear. Deep ancestral, bone-heavy. "You felt it," he said, "at the stones, when the distance changed, when the radio repeated you. It's not just a missing hiker anymore. If the land is in motion, we need to step back. That's what we were taught. But I couldn't accept that, not as an officer, not as someone responsible for the people who trusted us. We don't get to step back," I said. "Someone's missing. Something dangerous is out there. We don't just walk away." The council exchanged resigned looks, then formally ended the meeting. Daniel followed me into the hallway afterward, moving carefully like someone approaching a wounded animal. "You don't understand what you're insisting on," he said. "Some boundaries aren't ours to cross. Not physically, not spiritually. Sometimes the land warns before it takes. Warnings don't matter if someone's dying out there." I answered. Daniel flinched. "That's exactly how it takes." Our conversation ended there, not because we'd finished, but because we couldn't find a shared language anymore. His warnings felt like superstition to me. My insistence felt like betrayal to him. Later that afternoon, when Daniel clocked out early, I told myself he needed rest. In truth, I needed distance, to think without the weight of his fear pressing on my ribs. As dusk crept across the sky, painting everything in bruise light, I drove alone to Evan Lauren's last known location. No one had ordered me there. No one had authorized continued search activity. But duty is a stubborn thing, and guilt even more so. The desert felt different when I stepped out of patrol SUV, hushed but listening, like a courtroom waiting for testimony. I walked toward the ridge where we'd found the torn pack, guided by memory and dread. The wind should have carried sound, but it didn't. Every footstep echoed too sharply, as though the air itself were stripped thin. Even when I breathed, I heard the intake of air more loudly than I should have, like hearing myself from inside a microphone. Halfway up the ridge, I saw them, not the original prints, but a new set running parallel. These were unmistakably patterned after a human stride, heel-to-toe spacing, consistent distance between steps, but still bearing that long, narrow shape, as though something had observed human movement and tried to replicate it using whatever limbs or form it possessed. The effect was wrong. Deep impressions shaped like the earlier tracks, yet placed in an eerily familiar rhythm. It set every hair on my body on edge. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered. The desert swallowed the sound, amplifying it strangely so it bounced back a fraction of a second late. I crouched, tracing one of the prints. The sand around was disturbed in smooth, spiraling patterns, reminiscent of water swirling down a drain. Something had pressed into the earth not with mass, but intention. My radio crackled suddenly, loud enough to jolt me upright. "Hey!" Daniel's voice said. "Stop. Don't go further." The voice sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I grabbed the radio. "Daniel? Where are you?" No answer. I tried again. "Daniel, come in. This isn't funny." Silence. Then a hiss like static being pulled tight, followed by my own voice. "Where are you?" Repeated back to me. Flat. Toneless. Wrong. My throat tightened. Sweat prickled across my palms despite the evening chill settling in. "Daniel, if that's you, respond right now." The radio clicked, and this time the voice sounded less like Daniel and more like a poor imitation of him. Cadence correct but lacking breath, like someone repeating lines they'd memorized phonetically. "Stop," it said. "Don't go further." Exactly the same words as before. No deviation. No new sentence. Mimicry. I lowered the radio slowly, pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever was out here wasn't just watching us anymore. It had learned our voices, our patterns, and was beginning to use them, against my better judgment. I stepped closer to the twin sets of prints. The human-like series ended abruptly at a dried patch of clay. The original long, narrow prints, however, continued farther, toward a cluster of weather-worn junipers marking the unofficial border of restricted land. Colorful prayer ties fluttered from low branches, dancing without wind. Daniel had warned me never to cross them. "That's where the land starts watching back," he had said. I dismissed it then. But now the boundary looked less like tradition and more like a warning line drawn by something older than laws. I stood there, breath caught in my throat, knowing I shouldn't cross, knowing that even stepping closer broke something sacred. And yet, the tracks led forward, as though daring me to follow. Against every instinct, I stepped over the first tie. The world shifted immediately. Sound sharpened to a painful clarity. Individual grains of sand skittering under my boots, the pop of cooling stone, even a faint tremor of my heartbeat. Distance warped. Shadows stretched too long. The air pulsed like a living thing. Something had noticed me. My radio crackled one last time. Quietly, almost gently, my own voice whispered back to me, "You shouldn't be here." Then everything went silent. As I backed away from the prints, retreating toward the patrol vehicle, a single truth dug its claws into my mind. I hadn't just crossed the territorial boundary. I'd crossed into something's attention, and it wasn't going to forget me now. After crossing the prayer ties and hearing my own voice echo back through the radio, I spent the next day in a fog. I replayed every detail, every warped sound, every impossible print, until my mind felt rub raw. Something had noticed me, something that understood patterns, footsteps, distance, and now, voices. I couldn't shake the certainty that if I sat still long enough, I would hear it again, whispering the way it had whispered my words back to me. But Daniel avoided me entirely, arriving late for shift briefing, and leaving early without a word. Whatever rift had opened between us widened by the hour. By nightfall, I couldn't tolerate the uncertainty anymore. I drove out to the original livestock site, alone, telling myself it was to reassess the scene. In truth, I needed to know if what I'd experienced near the restricted boundary had followed me, or if the land itself had been reacting only to the trespass. The sky was moonless, the desert black except for my patrol headlights sweeping across broken fencing and dry earth. I set up a temporary surveillance post 50 yards away, positioning myself in a shallow depression with clear visibility of the pen. Regulations didn't cover supernatural entities, but they did cover night observation techniques. That was enough to let me pretend this was procedural. Almost immediately, I noticed something wrong. The desert wasn't merely quiet, it was absent. No insects chirping, no rustle of night wind. Even the brush felt motionless, as if held in place by invisible hands. The silence pressed against my ears so intensely that my breathing sounded intrusive, like I was disturbing a space that wanted to remain untouched. I lifted the thermal scope, scanning the perimeter. At first I saw nothing, just the cold blues and greens of nighttime terrain. Then, at the far edge of the display, a heat signature appeared. Tall as an elk, but shaped nothing like one. Its form stretched upward, narrow and unnervingly linear, more like a person elongated by some unnatural force. It wasn't crouched, grazing, or pausing in curiosity. It simply stood, radiating heat in a solid column that pulsed faintly, as if its temperature shifted in slow waves. Then it moved, not fluidly like an animal or human, but in perfectly straight lines, each stride identical in length. After 5 steps, it stopped. Exactly 5. Not 4. Not 6. I tracked it carefully, heart pounding. Something about the rhythm felt rehearsed, practiced, almost mathematical. When it turned, the thermal image warped, its body bending sideways in a way I couldn't comprehend. For a moment the scope struggled to interpret its outline, and the shape flickered between several distorted frames, none matching the others. It was as though the thing existed in more than one position at once, and the device couldn't decide which was real. A soft crunch of gravel behind me nearly made me drop the scope. I spun around and saw Daniel climbing down the slope toward me. His face was pale even in the dimness. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, but I felt something watching me. I thought maybe we're out here too. I gestured for him to keep low. "There's something at the far edge of the field. Don't make noise." He lifted the thermal scope, and the moment he looked at the figure, his breath hitched loudly. He lowered the device instantly, pressing his fist against his mouth as though holding back nausea. "It's noticing us," he murmured. "How can you possibly know that?" He didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the livestock pen. The air seemed to thicken as the heat signature shifted direction. It began walking again, 5 steps, then stillness, then 5 more. Each time it stopped, its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilted slightly, not toward our position, but toward where Daniel knelt. It took one more step. Only one, but this time it left a track visible even from our vantage point. Not in a natural curve or alignment, but as if impressed into the dirt by intention alone. The imprint was half human in length and half something else, its edges shimmering slightly like a heat haze mirage. As we watched, the shape twisted, elongating, narrowing, widening again, never settling into one form. The earth trembled faintly. Daniel's posture stiffened. The entity mirrored him, copying the angle of his shoulders, then the tilt of his head, then the slow inhale he drew through clenched teeth. I felt myself go cold. It wasn't merely observing. It was interpreting, learning his stance, testing how it might wear his shape the way one tests a garment before slipping on completely. Daniel began to pray softly, the same prayer he'd spoken at the stone circle. The sound was fragile, threaded with desperation. I grabbed the patrol spotlight and switched it on, sweeping the beam across the pen. The blazing white light revealed nothing. No creature, no shape, no movement. The thermal scope still showed it standing there, but the naked eye saw only empty desert. Empty. except for the tracks continuing forward, one after another, forming in a line as though something unseen walked in real time, matching Daniel's breathing. Cold terror flooded me. If the spotlight didn't reveal it, then the thing existed beyond visible perception. It walked not through space, but through expectation, predicting each step before the ground even received it. It moves by prediction, I whispered, not by motion. Daniel's eyes widened at the same moment the entity shifted again, its thermal outline expanding suddenly as though recognizing its imitation had been noticed. Without warning, the air around us pulsed, a shock wave of pressure that sent sand scattering across our boots. We didn't wait to see what came next. Instinct took over. We bolted toward a patrol SUV, stumbling over rocks and brush, not daring to look back. When we reached the vehicle, Daniel yanked open the passenger door, breath ragged. "Once it knows your pattern," he said, voice cracking, "it doesn't stop." His words landed heavier than any warning he'd given before, because now I knew what it meant to be noticed, what it meant to be learned. And somewhere in the darkness behind us, the desert continued rearranging itself around footsteps that predicted who we were becoming. Daniel barely spoke during the drive back from the livestock site. His hands rested stiffly on his knees, fingers twitching in a rhythm that didn't match his breathing. I kept glancing at him, hoping he'd say something, anything, that might undo what we'd seen. But he stared straight ahead, face carved from tension, lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. Whatever had mimicked his stance, his voice, his very pattern, it had shaken something fundamental in him. Over the next few days, he grew even quieter. He completed his reports mechanically and avoided eye contact during patrol briefings. He stood apart from the others, shoulders hunched like he expected the floor to open beneath him. When I asked if he wanted time off, he only shook his head. "I can't step away," he murmured once. "The land doesn't forget a mistake." When I pressed him for clarity, he turned away, whispering words I didn't recognize, prayers maybe, or apologies. By the third day, officers started noticing him pausing in hallways, not because someone called his name, but because he heard footsteps behind him, always just 1 or 2 steps, always stopping exactly when he did. Once, I caught him standing in the parking lot long after shift change, head tilted as though listening to something I couldn't hear. When I approached, he startled so violently he nearly drew his weapon. "It's following me," he said, voice trembling. "Not walking behind me, learning behind me." "Daniel," I said gently, "you need rest. Trauma can cause." "This isn't trauma," he snapped. Then quieter, "It's consequence." I wanted to argue, but the dark circles beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, made my throat tighten. He looked hunted, haunted. I arranged for him to take a week off, told him it was non-negotiable, but he came to work the next morning anyway, uniform pressed, eyes hollow, insisting he had to stay moving. "If I stop," he whispered, "I think it will too, and then it will catch me." That afternoon, I drove him home and waited in my vehicle to make sure he got inside safely. His small trailer sat on the edge of the community, where the desert pressed closest. Just as he reached the steps, he froze. I followed his gaze and saw them, tracks in the dust, not random, not scattered. A line of prints perfectly aligned with Daniel's own boot size, stride, and angle. They led from the road straight to his door, each impression deep enough to hold shadow even in daylight. Daniel's voice cracked. "It's practicing." I stepped out of my SUV. "We'll document this. I'll bring housemen out here." "No." His tone was sharp, almost panicked. "This isn't a case. It's a message." "Daniel." He backed away from the prints, retreating inside without another word. I waited outside far longer than necessary, unable to shake the feeling that the air around his home was listening. Over the following days, I tried to protect him the only ways I could, adjusting his shifts so he didn't patrol alone, assigning him daylight tasks, giving him any excuse to stay near populated areas. But he sensed my attempts and resisted all of them. "It won't matter," he said during one patrol. "It already knows my shape, my steps, my breath. I shouldn't have crossed that boundary with you." Guilt lodged in my chest, sharp and unrelenting. I crossed it. I reminded him. Not you. He shook his head. I followed you. That was enough. The land keeps track. On the seventh night after our encounter at the livestock pen, the radio woke me at 2:13 a.m. dispatch, called to say Daniel hadn't checked in at his usual midpoint during patrol. At first, I thought he might have simply lost track of time, but something inside me already knew that wasn't the truth. I threw on clothes, grabbed my keys, and sped to his assigned route. His patrol SUV sat idling on a dirt turnout, headlights pointed at empty desert. The driver's side door hung open. His radio lay on the ground a few feet away, still transmitting. I knelt and lifted it, then froze. Breathing filled the channel. Slow, deep, too deep. It didn't sound like Daniel's normal rhythm. It sounded stretched, elongated, as though coming from lungs that weren't built for human pacing. Daniel, I said into my own radio. If you can hear me, answer. The only reply was that steady, unnatural breathing. My stomach twisted. I started sweeping the area, calling his name, tracking footprints. His boot prints led away from the vehicle toward a series of low dunes. But halfway there, the pattern faltered. His stride became uneven, shorter, like he'd stumbled or been pulled. At the top of the first dune, I saw it, a circular disturbance in the dust, a perfect ring, the sand drawn outward as though something had risen from beneath the surface. The center of the circle dipped sharply, like the impression left by something heavy but shapeless. Around perimeter, Daniel's boot prints formed a scattered arc that suggested a struggle, one he hadn't won. I stepped into the circle, heart pounding. The air felt heavy, warmer than the surrounding desert. My radio hissed again, that slow breathing growing louder, closer. I turned in a full circle, trying to understand what I was looking at. But the only thing left behind, besides the disturbed dust, was a single track pressed into stone. Not sand. Stone. The print was fused into the rock, like molten metal poured and cooled. Long and narrow, but with a subtle curve this time, almost human. It was as though the entity had begun finalizing a shape it had been practicing. I dropped to my knees, hands shaking uncontrollably. Daniel, I yelled, voice cracking so violently it tore at my throat. The desert absorbed the sound without echo. No answer. No hint of where he'd gone. Just that fused, impossible track marking the end of his path. Guilt slammed through me with crushing force. All this time, I'd insisted on logic, truth, evidence. I'd pushed forward when he'd begged me to stop. I'd followed the tracks. I'd dragged him with me. And now the land, or the thing moving across it, had taken him instead of me. I pressed my forehead to the sand, unable to breathe. The radio still lay on the ground beside the circle, broadcasting that slow, deliberate breathing. Not Daniel's, but something imitating him. Something satisfied. It chose, and because I refused to stop, I whispered, tears soaking into the dust. Because I dragged him into this. I stayed kneeling until dawn, unable to move, unable to leave the place where Daniel's footsteps ended and something else began. And as the morning light crept across the desert, I understood one devastating truth. Whatever had claimed Daniel wasn't finished. Not with him. Not with me. Not with the patterns it was learning. I stayed on my knees until the sun rose, until the shadows of the dunes stretched long and thin like skeletal fingers across the sand. Daniel was gone. The circle of disturbed dust, the fused track in stone, the radio repeating that unnatural breathing. All of it felt like proof that the land had closed around him and refused to give him back. I didn't move until my legs went numb, until my throat dried from whispering apologies into a silence that refused to acknowledge them. But grief can only hold you still for so long before rage pulls you upright again. By noon, I was driving toward the council grounds. I didn't bother calling ahead. I stormed into the meeting Hogan, interrupting their discussion about water rights. Elder Natani looked up first, face fallen the moment he saw mine. He already knew. The others followed his gaze, and a ripple of tension moved through the room. You crossed a path that wasn't yours, Natani said quietly, and now someone has paid for it. I clenched my fists. I don't care what path I crossed. I need to know how to bring him back. Murmurs spread, uneasy, disapproving. Councilwoman Yazzie rose slowly. Officer, you were warned. When you stepped beyond those prayer ties, you broke a boundary meant to protect us all. The land reacts to disruption. The land took him. I snapped. You want to talk about protection? Then tell me how to undo what happened. Natani gestured for me to sit. I refused, but he continued anyway, voice steady. What you saw is not a creature, not a spirit. It is a balance mechanism, something older than any of our clans. It appears when rhythms break, when crossings are made without permission, when decisions ripple across ground not meant to bear them. I shook my head. That doesn't tell me what it wants. It wants order, he answered. It takes patterns to correct imbalance. Once it chooses someone, it learns them, step by step, breath by breath, until it can walk their path completely. My stomach tightened. So Daniel is trying to become him? Natani closed his eyes briefly. It is trying to complete him. His wording struck me like a blow. Complete him? That sounds like killing him. No, the elder said. Worse. Replacement. I felt the room tilt slightly, the weight of his words pressing down until breathing hurt. There has to be a way to stop it, to bring him back. Natani hesitated, then reached for something wrapped in cloth beside him. When he unwrapped it, I saw Daniel's spare badge, clean, polished, and used. My throat tightened painfully. Each person leaves marks on the land, Natani said. But a badge carries more than a mark. It carries duty, direction. If you retrace the path that led you across the boundary, undo every crossing, step by step, you may force the land to confront you instead of completing what it began. You're saying I have to draw it out. He nodded. The land knows your pattern now too. It learned you when you cross the ties. If you return, it will meet you. I swallowed hard. And Daniel, Natani looked away, gaze fixed on a spot in the dirt. If he still walks anywhere, he walks between forms. What is taken is rarely returned whole. The room wavered around me. Still, I reached for the badge. Its weight felt wrong in my hand. Too heavy, too cold. Then tell me how to start. Retrace the forbidden path, Natani repeated. Return to the exact boundary you crossed. Follow your earlier pattern in reverse. Only then will it reveal itself fully. Councilwoman Yazzie added softly, but if you go alone. No officer, no rescuer, no trainee can walk with you. This is your consequence to face. I nodded once. I didn't trust my voice not to break. I left without another word. Daniel's badge clenched so tightly in my hand that the edges dug into my skin. Dusk was spreading across the horizon by the time I reached the turnoff toward the restricted lands. The desert stretched infinitely ahead, empty and waiting. I stepped out of the SUV and the silence hit me immediately, not peaceful, not natural, expectant. I walked toward the spot where I had first crossed the prayer ties. With each step, the world felt slightly misaligned, like the land was adjusting itself around me. The ridges in the distance seemed to drift. Shadows crawled in directions that didn't match the dying sunlight. Daniel's badge warmed in my palm, as though reacting to the place that had last felt its owner. Halfway across the flats, I paused. I heard footsteps behind me, precisely matching mine. I spun around. No one stood there, but the footsteps continued for one more beat before falling silent. A tremor went through me. This was how Daniel had felt. Watched, followed, learned. The realization tightened around my spine. I continued forward. Every few minutes, I noticed tracks forming beside mine. Never ahead, never behind. Always beside. Always mirroring. One footprint would appear in the sand just as I lifted my foot, as though an invisible echo walked in parallel, learning the angle of my stride. The prints wavered between forms, sometimes narrow and precise, sometimes curved like a human step. A blending, a becoming. When I reached the ridge, the desert shifted again. The air thickened, vibrating faintly. I heard breathing behind me, soft, steady, out of sync with my own. I forced myself not to look back. Fear was a magnet to this thing. Daniel had told me that without telling me directly. As the sun slipped away, the world dimmed into shades of bruised violet. The prayer ties appeared ahead, like ghostly ribbons dancing the wind, except there was no wind. Each tie fluttered subtly, as if responding to my presence. This was the boundary, the line Daniel had begged me not to cross. I stepped closer, heart hammering painfully. The breathing behind me grew clearer. It sounded almost human now, as if it had improved its mimicry. I clutched Daniel's badge so tightly the metal edges bit into my skin. "I'm here," I whispered. "You wanted my pattern? Then come take it." The prayer ties trembled. The ground hummed. And on the sand before me, a fresh print appeared. Long, narrow, shallow at the heel, deeper at the toe. Then another. Then another. It was approaching. I took one step forward. The land swallowed sound. Darkness pooled at the edges of the rocks like spilled ink. And I crossed the boundary Daniel warned me never to step beyond. Crossing the boundary felt different this time. In Chapter 8, the land merely shifted beneath me. Now, it seemed to rearrange itself with deliberate intention, as though every grain of sand recognized who I was and why I had returned. The moment my foot passed the last prayer tie, the air thickened. Not like fog, not like heat, but like a presence. The breathing behind me stopped abruptly. The world held still, waiting. I stepped further into restricted lands, moving carefully through a darkness that felt carved rather than cast. My flashlight cut a narrow cone through the emptiness, revealing nothing but smooth, unmarred terrain. No rocks, no brush, no life. It was as though something had scraped the land down to its bones and left behind only the memory of shape. Ahead, the ground leveled into a vast plain. The sand was smoothed perfectly, flat and reflective in the moonlight like polished slate. Not a single footprint marked its surface, mine or otherwise. Even the wind, which had carried grit across the open stretch, held back respectfully. The silence pressed against my skin until I could feel my pulse thudding in my jaw. This was the place where something waited to complete its pattern. I stepped onto the smooth plain. Immediately, the air wavered at the center of the expanse, not like heat shimmer, more like a fold, an invisible crease in the world bending where it shouldn't. The distortion pulsed outward, warping the moonlight. I stopped several yards away, heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might tear free. "Daniel," I whispered, not because I believed he would answer, but because part of me needed the sound of his name to anchor me. The distortion thickened. A shadow bled outward from the fold in the air, stretching along the surface of the sand, without any body to cast it. Slowly, impossibly, the shadow began to rise, filling itself piece by piece, as though an unseen sculptor was shaping a human outline from the raw dark. My breath hitched. The silhouette was unmistakable. Daniel, tall, narrow-shouldered, had slightly tilted from years of listening before speaking. His outline flickered, stuttering between smooth and jagged edges. But even in the distortion, I recognized the set of his jaw, the outline of his badge on his chest, the way his right foot angled outward. A sound rippled across the plain, like wind dragging across metal. Then the shadow deepened, gaining weight, gaining clarity. As I watched, the entity filled Daniel's shape more fully, as though it had learned him stroke by stroke. Copying details with patience and hunger, it lifted its head and breathed, the same uneven, stretched breathing that had come through Daniel's radio the night he vanished. "No," I whispered. "That's not you." The distortion pulsed again. The entity straightened, adopting Daniel's posture. So precisely my knees weakened. Then it took a step forward, leaving a footprint in the sand, half human, half narrow imprint. The shape wavered, unsure which form to finalize. Then it spoke. "Officer," it said, exactly in Daniel's voice. Except not exactly. The timing was wrong. The breath behind it was wrong. It was like listening to Daniel speak from miles away, or hearing him through a broken speaker. The cadence had been measured, learned, repeated back with eerie precision. "Officer," it repeated, tilting its head the way Daniel used to when he asked a question he already knew the answer to. My stomach twisted. The truth I had tried so hard not to see now stood inches away, shaped in the outline of the person I had failed to protect. This wasn't Daniel returning. This was something using Daniel's pattern to walk the human world. The entity stepped closer, and the air shivered around it. I staggered back instinctively, heart hammering. "Stop," I said. "You can't wear him. You can't become him." It mimicked my words immediately. "You can't wear him," it echoed. "You can't become him." My skin crawled. The moral weight of what stood before me hit, like a blow. I could let it finish. Let it take Daniel's form completely, move unnoticed among us, blending his steps and voice into its own until no one could tell where the imitation ended and the original had died. Or I could sever the bond it had been cultivating since the first impossible track appeared. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold metal of Daniel's badge. Natani had said it carried direction, duty, the imprint of Daniel's identity. If the entity completed Daniel, it would not simply mimic him. It would become the new Daniel, a dangerous echo allowed to move freely among the people Daniel loved. The entity extended one arm, as if offering to finish the transformation. Its fingers wavered between shape and blur. My hand closed around the badge. "I won't let you take him," I said, voice cracking. The silhouette flickered violently, as though my resistance disrupted its form. "Let take him," it repeated with overlapping tones, Daniel's voice spliced with something deeper. I lifted the badge and stared at it, this symbol that once represented hope, discipline, and connection. Now it represented the final link between Daniel and whatever had claimed him. Breaking it meant letting go of the last piece of Daniel I had left. But leaving it whole meant letting this thing walk the world in its place. I drew a long, shaking breath. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not to the entity, but to Daniel. Then I slammed the badge between my hands. Metal cracked with sound that rang across the plain like a snapped bone. The badge shattered into fragments that scattered across the sand. The entity reacted instantly, not with a scream. No sound left its form, but the world itself screamed. A vibration tore through the ground, rattling up my legs, into my spine, into my skull. My bones resonated as though struck by a tuning fork. The sand beneath the entity began spiraling inward, pulling itself into a whirlpool of dust and shadow. Tracks formed and unformed within the spiral. Daniel's, mine, the creatures, overlapping, collapsing, rewriting themselves in frantic succession. The distortion folded inward. The silhouette jerked violently, flickering between Daniel's shape and something stretched and crooked. Then the entire plane convulsed. My legs gave out. I collapsed as the whirlpool widened, sand draining as though into a hidden chasm. The sky fractured into streaks of darkness and pale light. I tried to crawl backward, but my limbs wouldn't obey me. The world twisted violently around the distortion, folding it on itself over and over until I couldn't tell where horizon ended and sky began. The vibration grew unbearable. Then everything went white, and I lost consciousness. I surfaced from unconsciousness slowly, as though dragged upward through layers of thick sand. When my eyes finally opened, I saw nothing familiar. No slate-smooth plain, no spiraling tracks, no distorted horizon. Instead, I lay on rough ground beneath a jagged outcrop of red stone. The sky above me glowed pale, early morning light stretching across a landscape I didn't recognize. My throat felt scraped raw. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I tried to sit up, but dizziness forced me back onto my elbows. Wherever I was, it wasn't anywhere near where I confronted the entity. When I managed to stand, my legs trembled violently. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the plane where the exchange had taken place. There was none. No smooth surfaces. No tracks. No sign of collapse or distortion. Only desert, broken, uneven, natural. As if the land had sealed its wound and erased every trace of what had happened. I stumbled for hours, delirious from thirst, until my radio crackled weakly. A voice, human, frantic, began calling my name. Relief hit so sharply it nearly buckled my knees. When the search party reached me, I must have looked half dead. They gave me water, lifted me into a rescue vehicle, and flooded me with questions I had no strength to answer. All I could do was stare out the window, expecting at any moment to see the smooth plain reappear like a mirage. It didn't. Back at the station, once they confirmed I wasn't physically injured, the questions intensified. Where had I been? How had I ended up miles from my last known location? What had happened to Daniel? I had answers to none of them. At least none I could give without being dismissed as unstable. I filed a report so vague it bordered on useless, stating only that I had become disoriented while searching for my missing partner. The chief investigator frowned at every line. They searched for Daniel for 8 days. Officers, tribal volunteers, even state helicopters combed miles of land. They found nothing. No prints, no clothing, no sign of struggle, no circle in the dust, no fuse track. Every piece of evidence I'd seen with my own eyes had vanished, swallowed by the land as though to protect whatever lived beneath it. Eventually, the search became a recovery operation, and finally, after enough time passed, Daniel's case became another unsolved disappearance. Quietly cataloged alongside hikers, ranchers, and travelers the desert had kept for itself. I hated that word, unsolved. It felt like a wound left open on purpose. When I returned to speak with the elders, their expressions were complicated, somber, cautious, measuring the weight of what I carried. Some offered condolences, small reassuring nods, or brief blessings in soft voices. Others looked at me with something closer to blame. You stepped across a boundary that had held for generations, one elder said. Breaking rhythm invites imbalance. But Natani placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. You did what you believed was necessary. Sometimes order requires sacrifice. Sometimes disruption is the only language the land hears. His words were meant to comfort, but they cracked something inside me instead. Necessary. Sacrifice. Disruption. None of those sounded like enough to justify losing Daniel. The department placed me on administrative leave pending full review. They cited exhaustion, dehydration, and psychological strain from traumatic exposure. I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength to. I spent most days sitting in my living room staring at Daniel's untouched badge fragments on the table. The metal edges still glinted faintly in certain light, as though remembering the moment they broke. It took 3 days before I noticed the tracks outside my home. At first, I thought they were mine, boot prints leading from the road to my front door. But when I knelt to examine them, I realized the truth. The spacing was wrong, too deliberate, too evenly measured. The direction was forward, but the stride didn't match my gait. The prints weren't following me. They were waiting. Twice I swept the dust clean. Twice the prints returned, identical down to each curve and indentation. The third night, I stopped brushing them away. I simply stood at my doorway staring at them, wondering if they would change, elongate, narrow, shift into some halfway form way the entity had done with Daniel. They never did. They remained patient marks, as though the land were waiting for my next step before deciding what to shape from it. Footsteps began again soon after. I'd hear them on late walks to the reservation, always behind me, always perfectly timed, always stopping exactly when I did. At first, I whipped around, expecting to see someone following. But of course, no one was ever there. The sound faded the moment I broke stride, replaced by a silence that felt almost disappointed. One night, while walking past the community center, I heard the footsteps so clearly that I pressed myself against a wall, holding my breath. The echo paused behind me, and then shifted slightly, adjusting its weight the same way Daniel used it before speaking. A chill ran through me. I turned slowly, pulse thudding in my ears. No figure, no shadow, only empty pavement. But the echo in the air wasn't empty. It carried familiarity, like someone learning how to be someone else. Was it Daniel's pattern reattaching itself to the closest match? Or was it the entity, incomplete after the badge shattered, searching for a new anchor to finish what started? I didn't know. That uncertainty began eating at me, growing sharper, heavier. Each night I returned home, those prints waited. Each morning, the sense of being watched grew stronger. My dreams filled with footsteps forming ahead of me, guiding me down paths I had never walked but somehow recognized. The elders continued treating me with wary respect. Some believed I'd severed a dangerous pattern and prevented the entity from completing its transformation. Others whispered that by breaking the badge, I had left the mechanism unfinished, leaving the shape incomplete, the rhythm broken, the balance disturbed. They never said it directly, but their glances told me what they feared. Something without form might be trying to build one. Maybe using the remnants of Daniel's pattern. Maybe using mine. On the 10th night of my leave, I stood outside my home, staring at the waiting prints. The wind didn't scatter them. The darkness didn't conceal them. They simply existed, expectant. I stepped back, and the prince seemed to lean forward. A silent proposition? Was this what Daniel felt before he vanished? Was the badge breaking an end or a beginning? The desert felt poised, the world holding its breath, waiting for the shape it wanted me to take next. I left the reservation 3 weeks after the tracks first appeared outside my home. I told the department I needed time, that grief had settled too deeply into my bones for me to work responsibly. They didn't argue. Some wounds are too large to hide, and mine, whether emotional, spiritual, or something deeper, was becoming a burden they could see even if they didn't understand. I packed what little I owned into the back of my truck and drove north until the desert gave way to towns that didn't know my name, didn't know Daniel's, didn't know anything about the patterns the land had begun shaping around us. For a while, I convinced myself distance would help. The farther I got from the boundary, the quieter my nights might become. But dreams are not bound by territory. They followed me with alarming precision. The first night in my new apartment, I dreamed of Daniel walking ahead of me across a field of pale dust, except his legs moved wrong. Too long in some steps, too short in others, bending at angles no human joint could bend. His footprints didn't trail behind him. They formed before he stepped, opening in the ground like small wounds he was obliged to fill. He never turned back, never acknowledged me, just moved forward toward a horizon that shifted every time I blinked. I woke drenched in sweat. My breath came in ragged bursts. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but it was only the refrigerator clicking on. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the dream hadn't been a dream at all, more like a memory from a place that shouldn't have belonged to me. The next night, the dream deepened. This time, I walked behind Daniel, matching him step for step, and the entity walked behind me, its breathing brushing against the back of my neck. When I turned, I saw nothing, but I felt the shape of its intention, the way it pressed itself against my movement, learning each minor adjustment of my stride. I woke gasping again, terrified of closing my eyes in case the footsteps continued forming without me. By the 4th night, the dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were instructions. The footprints in my sleep matched the ones waiting outside my door in waking life. Patterns followed me from place to place no matter how carefully I swept the walkway. Sometimes I'd hear faint scuffs of dust as though something practiced keeping pace with me, pausing when I paused. I stopped walking at night. I stopped opening my blinds. I stopped trying to convince myself this was grief. If it were grief, the prints would have been messy, uneven, human. But the tracks that appeared near my steps were patient and deliberate. Quiet invitations from something that understood distance better than I did. That's when I realized why I needed to tell this story. Not for closure. Not for absolution. Not even for Daniel, who deserved far more than the broken silence I've given him. I'm telling this because the tracks are appearing more often now, and closer to my walls. The entity, unfinished after I shattered the badge, may have shifted its focus. Daniel's pattern might have been interrupted, but mine is still intact, still something that observed long enough to begin learning. I feel it tracing me. When I walk across a room, I sometimes misjudge distance or stumble slightly, as though the world is adjusting beneath me the way it did near the restricted boundary. The land here shouldn't behave like that. This far north, the terrain is softer, greener. Yet some nights, for a few seconds, the floor seems to tilt or stretch. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to remind me that things don't forget once they've noticed you. I've tried speaking with local spiritual leaders, but the words feel wrong when I attempt to describe what happened. This is not a haunting or a possession or a curse. It is a pattern, a mechanism, a decision the land made when I cross into a place I never should have stepped. And patterns want completion. Every instinct tells me that speaking this aloud, or writing it, as I'm doing now, is dangerous. But silence feels worse. Daniel stayed silent too long, believing the land would respect his fear. I can't in the same way he did. So here it is, Everything I can offer is a warning. If you ever see tracks in the dirt or snow or dust that don't overlap, don't falter, don't wander, leave them. If the prints don't match any stride, if they appear with unnatural precision, if they fall beside your own steps instead of behind them, don't follow. Don't investigate. Don't document. Turn around and walk away. Because once the pattern learns you, once it recognizes the shape of your movement, it doesn't stop. It doesn't lose interest. It waits. It watches. It adjusts. I used to think the entity needed land, desert, boundaries, prayer ties. But lately I've realized it might not care about geography at all. It cares about rhythm. It cares about repetition. It cares about the path you walk, and how easily that path can be traced back to you. Yesterday, when I left for groceries, there were 3 prints under my apartment stairwell. They were shallow, spaced too evenly and subtly curved, almost human, but not quite. I swept them away before anyone else could see. Last night, I saw another set in the courtyard. These were worse. They were spaced exactly the way I walk when I'm tired. And still, I can't shake the feeling that someone out there knows what I mean. That someone else has seen prints like these. Strange, too measured, too patient. Someone else has heard footsteps that stop when they stop. Someone else has felt a presence learning the rhythm of their life. So I'm saying this plainly. If you've seen anything like this, I need you to speak up. Not for me. My pattern may already be too far gone. Not for Daniel. His path has long since been absorbed into something I can't hope to understand. But for you, for the rest of us, someone has to speak before it learns too many of us.